California's a big state with just about every kind of ecosystem you can think of. We have the tallest mountain in the continental United States, the lowest point in North America, and everything in between. But right in the middle of the state rests an often overlooked but equally significant ecosystem, the vernal pools.
So today we decided to do something a little bit different. An ecosystem like the vernal pools can't be summed up and studied by just one scientist. So today on RadioBio, we have 4 scientists to tell us all about what makes a vernal pool and what lives in these ephemeral ponds. And hopefully, by the end of this episode, you'll look at California grasslands in a whole new light. This is RadioBio. Don't know much biology.
Vernal pools have historically occurred throughout the Great Central Valley of California, but only a fraction of them still exists today. RadioBio is fortunate because the University of California, Merced, where we're based, has one of the largest vernal pool reserves right in its backyard. We talked with the director of the vernal pools to learn more about how the reserve was established.
So I'm Monique Colster, and I am the Vernal Pool and Grassland Reserve Director.
Okay.
The UC Natural Reserve System is the largest university-run and managed reserve system in the world. So it's pretty exciting that we're part of that the reserve's part of that. The reserve system, they own and manage up to 750,000 acres. Oh. And these are, there's 39 reserves, and we're number 39. We were the most recent to be added into the system. And all these reserves are located just various ecosystems throughout California to get kind of a sampling of all the different ecosystems of California. And the main mission for these reserves is to support university-level research, education, and then public outreach, and primarily to contribute to the understanding and wide stewardship of the earth and these local ecosystems. So the campus was going to be proposed actually for a site out on the reserve. And there's some hills out on the reserve, and it was going to be right basically on top of those hills in a little kind of university campus. And part of that process, we needed to do some biological assessments required by state and federal environmental regulations to assess the land. And out of those biological assessments, it was realized that the land was really highly concentrated in this really sensitive habitat, vernal pools, which have, we only have about 10% less, most likely 10% or less of vernal pool habitat left in the state. Mm. So that's so it's a threatened habitat. With the reduction of habitat, typically you see the reduction of species, and so one of those species was the fairy shrimp. So UC Merced is intimately tied with the fairy shrimp because of this happening in the discovery of the fairy shrimp and this and vernal pools.
Wait, did she say fairy shrimp?
You heard that right, fairy shrimp. We'll get to these creatures later in the episode. Okay, so only 10% of these vernal pools remain in California. What else is unique about them?
Yeah, so it's just first a very incredibly diverse, special habitat. I have to say, the more I learn about it, the more I personally fall in love with it. And I'd say whoever comes out here, it tends to be the same thing, where it's a habitat of such rare and unusual organisms. The Galapagos of the Central Valley, they are just so incredibly diverse. So it's just an incredible ecosystem that we have right here in the Central Valley. So of course the habitat makes it special. We're right next to campus, so it makes it really easily accessible for classes to come on out, for researchers to come on out to study the site. And then our population, we're right next to Merced. We've got an incredibly diverse population of not only students here, but of course our local community is incredibly diverse. So we're really serving this really neat community of folks, and we're all kind of learning about this special ecosystem together.
There's so much going on out there, and the reserve is so big, over 6,000 acres. So where to start? What are vernal pools, really? How do vernal pools form? Why are they here in the Central Valley?
Let's dive right into the pool with hydrologist Mark Rains. RadioBio's Sunita Pertiwi kicks us off.
Can you start off with who you are and what you study?
Sure. My name is Mark Rains. I call myself an ecohydrologist. I'm now at the University of South Florida in the School of Geosciences, where I'm a professor and the director of the School of Geosciences. And so I look at how the flux of water and things that move with water control the structure and function of each of those receiving ecosystems and collectively create sort of a resilient watershed.
So you talk about connectivity. Give us an example. So walk us through the vernal pools locally. First, what the vernal pools are, and then how those things connect downstream and upstream.
Sure. So first of all, let's start with saying that there are different kinds of vernal pools. They are not all one thing. They're all some flavor of perched hydrology, but it could be perched because there's clay-rich soils. It could be perched on mud flows and lahars. It could be perched in some places in Southern California on bedrock. The vast majority of them, though, are perched on durapans or some other such sort of low permeability layer in the shallow subsurface. And I'm talking sometimes a couple of centimeters, tens of centimeters in depth, less than a meter for sure.
So lahars and durapans form this hard layer that doesn't absorb water as quickly as other coarser soils, allowing the water to pool up or perch on top.
And that probably constitutes, the vast majority of them, and certainly the vernal pools on the surfaces around UC Merced are of this type. And so rain falls on this landscape and it infiltrates, but it's stopped pretty quickly by these slowly permeable or impermeable layers, and it begins to stack up there. And as that perched water table rises, it eventually intersects the topographic lows.
So it's like little bathtubs kind of buried under the sand. They all kind of connect.
And so the depression is sort of a low point in that landscape. And so as that water table rises, the first place you quote unquote see it is popping out in the vernal pools and the swales that connect them.
So water is actually flowing through the soil all around us. And it's only in these low points on the landscape, like streams, lakes, or these vernal pools, where we see it come to the surface.
Well, water moves pretty slowly in the subsurface, especially in a low gradient landscape like this and in the low permeability or relatively low permeability soils that you have here. Well, it moves pretty quickly across the surface. So once the water pops out into those vernal pools and vernal swales, it's got a pathway, and you can see this flow then moving rather rapidly across the landscape. And at first, it's what we hydrologists love to call deranged flow or incoherent flow, because the flow is sort of meandering about, and one pool connects to another pool, connects to another one. Sometimes water flows in two directions out of the same pool. But eventually you can get to sort of a steeper slope. There's a large enough watershed area that water starts to coalesce into a coherent channel, and those are your headwater streams that come off this landscape. And those then feed downwards into the larger streams and ultimately into Sacramento or San Joaquin Valley rivers, depending upon where you are in the valley. So there's a great example of connectivity. It starts with rain falling out of the sky on a landscape, and then it's this very elegant series of processes that have to take place, where the perching, the slow movement towards the microtopographic lows, the coalescing of those flows into the headwater streams, and ultimately, to the Pacific Ocean.
And where are they usually found?
You'll tend to find them from southern Oregon into northern Mexico, but the largest concentration of them are here in the Central Valley. The durapan is, rain falls out of the sky, it starts to infiltrate. It falls out of the sky with not a lot of solutes in it, and the solutes it have make it rather acidic. And so it's really good at dissolving rock. But for most of history, California's been kind of dry. And so it doesn't make it very deep before some of that water's re-evaporated, either transpired or just directly evaporated. And as it concentrates those solutes, particularly silica and iron, they get to hyperconcentrations and they come out of solution.
So the rain evaporates and leaves what was in that rainwater, the iron and the silica, behind, which binds the soil together. So the rain actually makes the durapan, which holds the rain.
Cool.
But it's undergoing lithification. It's becoming a rock, and that is largely impermeable. I mean, technically you could call it slowly permeable, because being a nerdy hydrologist, I don't want to say water can't get through it. It just doesn't get through it very quickly. And so these are landscapes that are not good at groundwater recharge. They're very good at the opposite thereof, which is perching the water, which is how you end up with, 10, 20%, sometimes more wetlands on landscapes in a landscape where you think, well, it never rains here, and why are there wetlands at all? Why are we're way above the water table? Well, it's because of this, as you said, self-reinforcing phenomenon that's created this opportunity.
So when the vernal pools are dry during the dry season, are they utilized for anything else other than for water?
There's a whole, it turns out, like if you could imagine, like one of the problems with trying to live in a vernal pool is that sometimes there's too much water and sometimes there's not enough, right? So it's and you're going to get you're going to get it every year. You have both conditions in a normal year anyway. And in a really dry year, you might go a year with no water, right? So you might always be no water for a while, so there might be a delay. And if you're a sessile organism like a plant, or you're not a particularly mobile organism like a fairy shrimp, you've got to figure out a way to handle that. Well, to do that, you got to be really specialized, and that's how you create endemism. Endemism is the property of an organism that only occurs in a particular place, under particular conditions. So, and vernal pools are well known for it because they are so weird, right? It's a weird thing. Like they're going to be totally flooded for 3 months, and then they're going to be like completely dry and baked hard during the other months. And if you're going to live there, you got to figure out how to survive both.
So this begs the question: what kind of creatures could survive both?
What better creature for that is there than an amphibian? Turns out that these pools are great habitat for a rare endangered species of salamander. We talked with Professor Brad Schaefer, a conservation biologist from UCLA, about California tiger salamanders.
What is your work on the UC Merced Vernal Pools Reserve?
The work we've done at the Vernal Pool Reserve is part of a long-term monitoring and research program that we've done on California tiger salamanders. California tiger salamanders are a federally endangered species, a federally listed species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And I've studied those animals since well before they were listed and continue to work on them to this day. Our lab's done a lot of the sort of basic science that's led to the listing and to the hopeful recovery of the species. The salamander is a vernal pool restricted species. They breed in vernal pools and they live in grasslands. So what we've done is we've studied tiger salamanders in California in several places where there are reasonably large tracts of protected grassland and vernal pool habitat, where we can study their ecology, we can study their genetics, and we can use that to do comparative studies across different parts of their range. And sort of what elements of their biology are common and what elements of their biology are unique to different patches of habitat. And all of that's important when we're trying to think about how to conserve them, how to restore them, how to keep them from going extinct, and ultimately how to get them off the endangered species list.
So you say these are listed endangered species. So
Correct.
What are some of the threats to the California tiger salamander?
The standard threat that really impacts virtually every species that's endangered with extinction, and that is habitat loss and habitat conversion. California tiger salamander habitat consisted of flat, open spaces in the Great Central Valley, the Salinas Valley, and one or two of the other Intercoast Range valleys. Well, there's a reason why California is the biggest agricultural state in the country, and it's because of those lands and turning them into very, they're incredibly productive lands for agriculture. Based on work we've done at protected areas like the Merced grasslands and also Jepson Prairie, what we found is that what tiger salamanders need is the terrestrial upland habitat, that is not the pool, but the land surrounding the pool, that goes out about 2 kilometers, which is about 1.33 miles, which means it's several thousand acres around each pool. And that's what they need, as best as we can tell, in order to keep a breeding population going for the long term. And that's a big chunk of real estate for a breeding site. And they really do much better if you have several different breeding pools, each with their 2,000 to 3,000 acres around them. They do fine with cattle, or at least they do fine with cattle. They do not do fine with row crops. They do not do fine with other sort of agriculture. So they have declined because of habitat loss throughout the vast majority of the Central Valley where they used to occur.
Why are they important? What are they doing in these vernal pool habitats?
Yeah, so they are important because they are generally the top predator in these vernal pools. So the vernal pools themselves are very rich, very interesting communities. They have, they have these little crustaceans, so things like fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. There are insects that breed in them, like dragonflies, mosquitoes. And it's a dynamic, interesting, fairly complicated little ecosystem in those vernal pools. And the tiger salamanders come in and they prey on all of those things. So they're a top predator. They just sort of help maintain that balance of different species, many of which themselves are endangered. And we've shown that if you remove the tiger salamanders, it just completely changes the distribution of everything from algae to tree frogs to snails to crustaceans. Just everything changes when you take them away because they're this very important top predator.
So species that play a large role in the ecosystem, so much so that their removal would disturb the balance of that ecosystem, are often called keystone species. Like a keystone in an arch, if the species is removed, the whole thing falls apart.
Not only are California tiger salamanders important for maintaining ecosystem balance, they're also just super cool critters. They can live up to 10 years and mostly live underground in burrows. They only come out to breed in torrential downpours in the winter. They can lay up to around 1,000 eggs at a time, but may only do this once in their lifetime or not at all before they head right back underground.
The salamanders eat lots of different invertebrates, including one kind called the fairy shrimp. We talked to Shannon Kieran, a fairy shrimp expert, about what these bizarre creatures are doing out in the vernal pools.
So what are some of the vernal pool invertebrate species that we have out there?
So there are a ton of invertebrates out there, but some of the really exciting ones are crustaceans, the fairy shrimp and the tadpole shrimp.
Cool.
So they're related to like the shrimp that you would see in the sea, but they're really distant cousins. And their closest cousins that people have heard of are probably like sea monkeys. They look like sort of like little Viking boats. They swim around on their backs. And they dart around in the pools, and they're called fairy shrimp because they have this darting motion that people thought looked sort of ethereal and fairy-like.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah,
Nice.
they're really cool.
So about how big are these fairy shrimp? Are they like sea monkey size, or are they like coconut shrimp size? Like, what are we talking about?
They're definitely a little bit bigger than a sea monkey. Maybe about 3/4 of an inch when they get big. So you can definitely see them with your naked eyes in the pool, and sort of whitey translucent. Some of them can get some really cool colors, though. If they eat cool algae, they can turn blue and red and pink. These guys are specially adapted to these temporary wetlands. They only live in temporary wetlands, so they're endemic to these kinds of temporary waters. And so they hatch out of these little eggs every time it rains, and they live their whole lives in 1 year in these little pools. And then when they lay new eggs, those eggs are resistant to drought. And so the pool dries down in the summer, and the eggs sink down into the soil, and they can stay there for years or even decades until it rains again. And then all of a sudden they hatch out.
So what do fairy shrimp do?
I mean, what does any animal do, really? They're filter feeders. So imagine a life in which all you do is sort of flit around on your back, funneling food down something called a food groove into your mouth.
Okay.
That's literally all they do. Every time they swim, they have these really cool little appendages. They have 11 pairs of legs, or phylopods, and they've got gills on the end. And every time they move these gills, they are doing 3 things all at once. They're breathing, so they're passing oxygen over their gills. They're moving through the water, and then they're funneling any particles that they come in touch with down this food groove into their mouths.
They're like living the dream.
Oh, totally.
Okay.
Totally.
Hedonistic crustaceans.
Yeah, absolutely. Just hanging out on your back and just shoveling the food towards your mouth.
Okay. And, I mean, so are these fairy shrimp important
Yes.
ecologically?
Fairy shrimp are really important ecologically. They serve as huge sources of food for basically any wading bird that shows up in these vernal pools.
Oh, yeah.
It's estimated they make up to a third of the diet for certain types of ducks during the winter. They are detritivores and filter feeders, so they help process the rest of the stuff. They eat muck and help keep the environment clean, and then they are eaten as food sources themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know how widely distributed fairy shrimp are in general, like globally even?
Yeah.
And then some of the species that we have here in California, how widely those are distributed?
Yeah, so fairy shrimp globally are really widely distributed. They're in the tundra, they're in sub-Saharan Africa, they show up in little rock pools. They're really cool because they have this adaptation of showing up in these temporary waters, and they have these cysts that can stay dry for so long. Mm-hmm. They can be really, really flexible as a larger group. But on a species level, there's a lot of endemics in California. Okay. California has really special vernal pools, and most of the fairy shrimp that we have here, we have only here.
Wow. So
the vernal pool fairy shrimp is found essentially only in California. There's one site in southern Oregon. Mm-hmm. The Conservancy fairy shrimp and Mid-Valley fairy shrimp are found only in the Central Valley. And then there's a few more that are a little bit more widespread, but there's more than a dozen endemic vernal pool crustaceans in California.
And so what do you study about these fairy shrimp?
So there's not a lot that we know about these shrimp yet. And so partly what I'm doing is I'm trying to find a way just to tell whether they're there in the vernal pools or not by looking at the pond water. So it's a technique called environmental DNA. Mm-hmm. And so what we do is we just sort of take a bottle of the pond water and we run it over a filter. So we just filter it like a coffee filter almost. Mm-hmm. And we can extract genetic material off of that filter that the shrimp leave behind in their environment and tell whether or not they're there.
So the shrimp aren't going through this filter. It's literally just the water.
Exactly.
And they're leaving traces of their environmental DNA that you're picking up and identifying these shrimp from.
Exactly. Okay. All of us and every organism leaves genetic material behind in its environment. We leave hair and skin cells and, waste material and our bodies. And so everywhere we go, there's a trace of us and our DNA in the environment. Mm-hmm. And so this is a way of detecting that genetic signature that's just there in the environment.
Mm-hmm. And so you're trying to detect these fairy shrimp. What are you finding out in the vernal pools right now?
So the Central Valley has an incredible wealth of vernal pool fairy shrimp species. Mm-hmm. And so we're finding, like here on the UC Merced Reserve, there are 6 species, including the tadpole shrimp, which is a cousin that looks a little bit like a horseshoe crab.
Cool.
And then there's the California lindariella and the vernal pool fairy shrimp, the Mid-Valley fairy shrimp, and the Conservancy fairy shrimp. Sorry, that's only 5. There are 5 vernal pool species out there. Uh-huh. And that's a huge diversity of species on a single vernal pool complex. It's almost unheard of. The UC Merced Grassland Reserve is a really special place.
Wow.
From a personal standpoint, what kind of drives your research, your interest in your research? Like, what's your favorite thing about fairy shrimp and the system that you work in?
Oh, gosh, I love everything about vernal pools. These little isolated wetlands have so much life in them and so much information, and there's so many questions about how things adapt to these environments, and once they're adapted, how well, if you move one 10 miles to a different pool, does it need to adapt again? Mm-hmm. Are they super adapted to their microhabitat? Especially when we see things like, this water table rises and suddenly it's all one big swampy floodplain. Mm-hmm. How does that affect things? And I'm also really interested in this cyst bank. These seeds, these eggs that can sit in the soil for decades. How does that change a species that lives in an environment that can change so quickly?
Yeah.
It really is so full of interesting questions.
We've heard about how vernal pools form and some of the unique organisms that live there, but there's so much out there to explore.
Like what?
Let's go back to Mo Kolster, director of the Vernal Pools Reserve.
There's research projects happening kind of on many aspects of the ecosystem. So hydrology, soils, plants, invertebrate like fairy shrimp. We've got amphibian studies, California tiger salamanders, mammal studies, bird studies. So kind of more specifically, we've got, you heard a little bit about hydrology of vernal pools. We've got a soils project going on using unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, and he's looking at basically soil moisture. Using drones to look at soil moisture. We have, and kind of the last one I'll just mention is an American kestrel study that was completed last year. She was looking at the American kestrel, which is the smallest falcon in North America, and in nest boxes that we have on the reserve.
What are some other species that, someone comes up to the vernal pools, looks out and just sees this brown grassland that they don't realize actually live out there? What are some maybe like, kind of to you, almost like flagship species of the vernal pools that people wouldn't think about being out there?
Yeah, other flagship species, burrowing owls, which are, they're just this really cool owl that hangs out in squirrel burrows, and they actually, they're a resident here, so they'll nest here. So they are definitely are part of our ecosystem, and we've got a lot of different other raptors, Swainson's hawks, and I'm blanking out right now. Let me think. Swainson's hawks. We've got golden eagles out there.
Seriously?
We do. We've got a golden eagle that likes to perch in the hills. So, other ones too that people don't think about, but we've got ground squirrels and gophers, which are actually keystone species out there. They are really key to maintaining the biodiversity of the raptors and the coyotes and the badgers that we have out there. So it's such a large piece of property, and we're surrounded by other conservation easements, ranch lands that are on conservation easements, that it's just, there's a lot of space for a lot of our wild animals to live.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people who aren't from the area might look at an area like that and just see it's like a brown, dead field, and they don't realize that it's like this living landscape.
It's alive, and I think that's what always amazes me. It doesn't matter what day I go out there, what time of year, there's always something to see.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah.
What's your personal favorite thing about the vernal pools? Is it like a time of day or something, a place in the pools that you like, or just something about the whole system that you like, your personal favorite thing?
Gosh, I think it's just the place. I think it's just driving, like leaving campus and driving out to the vernal pools, and you see this rolling landscape with this unique pockets of water that, it's just, and then you see the Sierra Nevadas in the background, and it's just a sense of peace.
RadioBio is produced by graduate students at the University of California, Merced. Support for RadioBio comes from the Quantitative and Systems Biology Graduate Group, the School of Natural Sciences, and the Graduate Division at UC Merced. You can help support RadioBio's mission of increasing scientific literacy in California's Central Valley and beyond by donating at giving.ucmerced.edu/radiobio. Find out more about our mission, events, and podcasts at www.radiobio.net.
This episode of RadioBio was produced by Lily Pennington, Kinsey Brock, and Jeff Lauder. The interviews were Kinsey Brock, Jeff Lauder, and Saninta Pertiwi. The podcast was edited by Jeff Lauder and Lily Pennington, and episode artwork was created by Kinsey Brock. Special thanks to Mo Kolster, director of the UC Merced Vernal Pools and Grasslands Reserve, for her stewardship of one of California's most special places. And thank you for listening.